Hello and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. With over 15,000 downloads since launch, we are excited to bring you Season 4 featuring in-depth content on business, global affairs and news across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. We've had some extraordinary guests on our channel, including W Series driver Abby Eaton.
And I've got thoughts of the future now. I'd love to try and kind of mentor some of the younger drivers,
Renowned UK international education champion, Professor Sir Steve Smith.
Over about a 4-year period, we kept increasing the resources going into mental health provision.
Chief Executive and Director of the London Design Museum, Tim Marlowe.
The way we design is actually thinking about the needs of everyone.
And CEO of the Industry Cluster Group at JTC, Alvin Tan.
If you look at TDD, we are creating an ecosystem of companies, government agencies and industry associations in the digital space.
Thank you, as always, for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy this podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast from the British Chamber of Commerce, Singapore ICT Committee. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Ian Stevenson, who is the CEO of Cycomb, a leading solution provider for digital forensics. Ian is also the co-founder of a fantastic organisation, the UK's Online Safety Tech Industry Association. So please, everyone, get ready for a dive into the world of online safety, where we'll be discovering tools and tips on how to protect yourself and your loved ones. Ian, I'm also going to add a personal thanks for joining us today, because you are offering me the first time I am able to interview a fellow Scot on this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's lovely to be with you today, Daisy. It's nice to meet you.
Brilliant. And you're based in Edinburgh, is it?
Yes, I'm based in Edinburgh, where this morning the sun is shining.
Oh, brilliant. The clouds have just started in Singapore because we've hit our 4 o'clock downpour. So nice to have that contrast. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover, Ian, and I know this is a topic that a lot of our members and listeners are really interested in. If you can start by helping us just to set the scene, a very high-level picture of the different categories of risks that we face when we go online.
Absolutely. So if you look at the way that lawmakers and policymakers are now thinking about this, we tend to talk about harms in 3 major categories. The first is contact, the second is conduct, and the third is content. So if we start with contact, that's where you're online and somebody contacts you with a bad intention. That it will be a one-to-one conversation, and they may be trying to defraud you, they may be trying to sell you something that's not real, or they might be trying to groom you into some sort of abusive relationship, but it tends to happen one-to-one in a private space. The second category is conduct, and that's about how people behave online. So, for example, if you get a group of people all ganging up on somebody and very heavily disagreeing with them or criticizing them, the things they're saying individually may not be particularly bad. I mean, if I say to you, Daisy, I don't like you, which is untrue, but if I say that, that's free speech, that should be protected, that's okay. But if myself and all my mates gang up on Twitter or Facebook and all start saying that, then collectively, our conduct's going to have a pretty big and probably pretty negative impact on you. And then the third category is content, and that's where the thing itself is bad. So the most obvious and possibly most serious there is child abuse. There are people who are exchanging images and videos of child abuse online. There is just no excuse. There is no valid need for that. That's illegal virtually everywhere in the world. That's content that is bad. But there's also a lot more subtle and in some cases more controversial types of harmful content, and it can be context dependent. So for example, non-consensual intimate images or revenge porn can be pretty harmful to a group of people and exchanged online, even though, in a different context, they might be legal. Pornography is legal in many, many parts of the world, but most people agree that children shouldn't be exposed to that. So that's context dependent. Perhaps most controversial is where you get into mis and disinformation, because of course people should have free speech to have a wide range of opinions, and there should be freedom to discuss these things. But at the same time, at scale, we are seeing enormous health impacts around the world. There's a recent World Health Organization study on this. We're seeing enormous impacts on people's health, where they are believing what they think are trustworthy sources of information online, but which actually, scientifically speaking, are telling them things which are harmful to themselves, whether that's about vaccinations, and we should be able to dissent on that subject, but there has to be some sort of balance to that conversation, whether that's about vaccinations or a preference for crystal healing and acupuncture over surgery and chemotherapy for cancer patients. We are seeing people dying because of mis and disinformation, but we want to allow free speech. So contact, conduct, and content. And within those, there's lots of different subcategories. So basically, there's lots of different bad things that can happen in the online world.
Absolutely. You've adequately scared us all, Ian. And I like that you've succinctly put all our fears into a nice framework, 3 C's. So now you've done that, though, if we could start going on to the more positive and start talking about, the different tools, particularly in the space of what organizations like yourself, what governments, how you're starting to tackle that.
Absolutely. So, I think the internet was created with nothing but good intentions to help people communicate to each other and learn and connect and do business in whole new ways. But, humanity's got a pretty good track record of creating and inventing things with really good intentions. And it turning out they have some side effects. The first motor cars changed the way people traveled and lived, but then we started realizing that people were dying in collisions when they really oughtn't be. And in some ways, I think that's where we are with online safety now. And Julia Mam-Grant, who's the Australian e-safety commissioner, talks about having our seatbelt moment. So in the 1960s, the first seatbelt laws were introduced for cars, and the car manufacturers at the time were saying, well, if you put seatbelts in cars, you will make them expensive, unaffordable. We won't be able to design nice cars anymore. People won't have choice. People should be able to choose whether they have a seatbelt or not. But the evidence was increasingly emerging that simple changes to cars, like installing seatbelts, would save lives and reduce injuries. And the first seatbelt laws were controversial when they were introduced. But as they were introduced and seatbelts started appearing in cars and people started wearing them, the overwhelming evidence was that it was a good thing overall, and it saved lives. And if you think about what happened with that story, it started with seatbelts, then we started thinking about crash protection, we started thinking about standards for fuel tanks so they didn't crumple and explode. And from the idea that safety was something enormously controversial, we've now got to a point where safety is front and center of many car brands advertising campaigns. If you go onto the website of a car vendor today, they will have their Euro NCAP crash rating. They will have an endless list of features that are designed to keep you safer. There seems to be a competition to fit as many airbags as possible. There seems to be a competition to create safety features that will automatically brake the car, that will make it brake smoothly, all the rest of these things to keep us safe. And Julia Mam-Grant's assertion, and it's one I wholeheartedly agree with, is that we're just at the moment of the first seatbelt laws in terms of online safety. We're at that moment where society has collectively realized that we've created something amazing and brilliant, but it's also quite literally killing people and destroying lives, and that some of that isn't a necessary function of having the internet, having social media, having online platforms. It's just because we haven't designed it and haven't thought about it as well as we should have. So while some of the platforms are doing a lot of things voluntarily, and that is good, just like some automakers, we're always better than others, governments are now saying that populations have a reasonable expectation of being able to go online in safety, and they're looking at legislating and regulating to make sure that the providers of the online services that have become such critical parts of our lives are meeting basic safety standards. And in Europe, we've seen the Digital Services Act. That's now passed as legislation, but not yet implemented. In the UK, we've got the Online Safety Bill going through Parliament right now. We expect to see that finalised quite shortly. You know, Australia, I mentioned Julia Grant. They've appointed an e-safety commissioner with extensive powers. In the US, we've seen a number of different laws being debated at federal and state level. Perhaps most significantly in recent times, the California legislature passed the age-appropriate design code. So we're seeing regulators turn around and say, actually, platforms, internet service providers, you've got to do something about this. And a lot of what they do is going to come down to installing safety technologies, installing the online equivalent of seat belts to try and detect and prevent, or detect and mitigate harms before they happen. And some of that, and a lot of it today, involves tens of thousands of people who are employed directly or indirectly by the big platforms to look at stuff, either proactively or when it's been reported by another user or when it fits a certain pattern of behavior, and make a judgment as to whether it's acceptable or not. But they're also supported by a battery of technology. And some of that is to do things like detect known child abuse and block that from being uploaded in the first place. Some of that is much more subtle. It's about detecting conversations that are potentially turning hostile or adversarial and giving an opportunity for intervention. Some of those will operate in an automated and unattended way. Some of them are supporting human moderators, making them more efficient and effective, and highlighting content to them. But both economically and socially, we have to increase the role of technology in this space. Economically, because human moderators are really end up being pretty expensive and not a particularly scalable solution, but also socially, because doing that moderation is a horrible job. And, you know, it was captured for me in a rather cheeky British press headline a couple of years ago. You know, Facebook moderator sues Facebook for trauma of being exposed to Facebook. You know, if you are spending all day, every day, exposed to the worst of human nature as it is expressed online, that can have a pretty big impact on your personal mental health. And amongst moderators, many of whom are low-paid people in economies where they have very little in the way of employment protection or support. You know, the Philippines and Indonesia are locations frequently used for low-cost moderation. You know, the suicide rate, the mental illness rate, the rate at which people involved in this work end up becoming sucked into some of the toxic environments, some of the harms that they're supposed to be protecting against, is terrible. And we've seen companies pull out. There was a company in Texas that withdrew from providing moderation services. They provided a range of business process outsourcing, and they withdrew because morally they did not believe it was right to pay people to do things which were so potentially damaging to them.
Wow, yeah. You know, hard to imagine someone doing that day in, day out, the mental load it carries. But then, you know, you make that such a great analogy. Is right now we need that. You know, we've hit that seatbelt moment. So how then can we create the technologies needed so that we have the solutions that are required, both on the prevention side and on when, you know, because bad people are going to do bad things. So certainly in cybersecurity, you know, the message, it's can't just all be about prevention. It's about detection and dealing with the incident once it's identified. Can you just start to elaborate on some of those technologies? What does it look like, both on the prevention side and on the investigation side, once we know something bad has taken place?
Absolutely. So, you know, there are technologies that are already deployed today and in use at scale. They fall into quite a range of different categories. I mean, I've sort of started hinting at this a little, but you know, at one end of the spectrum, there is some content like child abuse that is known to be bad and illegal. You can catalog that content, and, you know, using a database-driven approach, you can prevent that content from spreading. So that's, you know, one example of where you can essentially put up a first line of defense that says, we know this stuff is bad, it shouldn't be allowed on the platform. As you work through different harm types, that isn't applicable everywhere. For example, that's much less applicable to conduct-based harms. So if you look at a lot of platforms today, they will offer you a report button. And if you feel something bad is happening to you, you can press that button and it will draw somebody's attention to that. And hopefully they will intervene in a positive and helpful way. And that's the human part of it, but there's a bunch of technical infrastructure to support that. If you then look at what platforms are doing, there are a range of machine learning, artificially intelligent technologies that will try to proactively detect things going wrong in certain environments. So for example, they can detect when conduct is resulting in a group response to an individual. They can detect whether the tone of that is positive or negative, and they can potentially highlight that to a moderator. They can identify in tools like Facebook Messenger, which is not an encrypted platform, they can identify the sorts of behaviors that might be indicative of grooming or fraud. Even in encrypted platforms, there's really amazing work going on that even without looking at the content of messages can identify patterns. So for example, if it knows some users have a behavior pattern that is adult and other users have a behavior pattern that is child, and one of those adult users appears to be trying to spontaneously contact a lot of child users, that's something that might raise a red flag. And in fact, some platforms that know the age of their users would even specifically block that. So they allow children to reach out to people to make friends with them, but they don't allow adults to reach out to children. So there's a lot that's already in use. And it's powerful and important, but it's not evenly applied. So if we took the best of what was deployed today and that were applied to every platform, we'd already be taking an enormous step forward. There's then, and that's one of the things that legislators seek to drive. I think the sort of second area is that there's a lot of technology being produced, often by starting out with academics and then spinning out into small companies, that is a step ahead of the sort of recognized state of the art today. It solves some of the problems that the technologies in use today can't. And we're starting to see increasingly some of those new technologies getting deployed. And that's the space my own company, Cycomb, operates in. We have a technology platform called Cycomb Safety built to solve a couple of the big problems in that space. One of them is for known harmful content. It's very often difficult to get the right data in the right place because that content is sensitive. It's often illegal to move it around, even if it's not illegal. So for example, non-consensual intimate images, they're not illegal in of themselves, but the intent behind them often is. But obviously the people who are the victims of those images don't want that data just shared willy-nilly in the hope of preventing it. You need high privacy. So we provide really high privacy, high security solutions to make the right capabilities, the best possible data available wherever it's needed to block and detect content. And we've also got capabilities that are pretty unique to work inside encrypted messaging environments, because as the world moves towards encrypted platforms, so do offenders, because it's harder for platforms and law enforcement to detect their bad behavior. We've got, I think, the only proven solution that can detect known harmful content, such as child abuse, in those environments and block it, but without completely ruining people's privacy. It completely protects your privacy. The police can't read your messages, Putin or the newspapers can't read your messages, but it can detect and block those content. So that's an example of a next generation technology, and there are others as well. So age verification is a rapidly expanding area. I, as you mentioned, run the Online Safety Tech Industry Association. One of our members, Yoti, has had a lot of success recently helping organizations, including Instagram and Facebook Dating, deploy age verification to ensure that users on their platforms are an appropriate age for that service and can access appropriate content. And again, that's not a trivial problem, because most people don't want to verify their age by sending somebody a copy of their government issued ID. That's a pretty big security and privacy risk. I wouldn't recommend doing that. But what Yoti have done is built a system that can pretty reliably verify people's ages to, it's published and demonstrated statistical accuracy, but without requiring you to share government issued ID. So it can protect your privacy and the security of your personal data while still enabling platforms to know the ages of their users. So there's a new wave of technology coming that platforms are just starting to adopt, and I think regulators are hoping that regulation will help them adopt that more rapidly. And innovation in this space will doubtless continue. There's a growing cohort of companies producing novel, innovative and creative solutions that can help. But as you said, prevention isn't going to stop this problem, because however good your prevention technology is, there will always be people who will find ways to circumvent that. There will always be an uneven level of deployment. So it's also really important that when law enforcement have to be involved, they have good tools to do their jobs. And that's the digital forensics space. And again, that's somewhere my company works with Cycomb Forensics. Unfortunately, as technology stands today, there is a lot of online referrals to law enforcement. I mean, if you take the UK alone, tens of thousands of items of information come into the UK law enforcement each month, suggesting that people are accessing child abuse content online. So they are overwhelmed by the number of these cases they could pursue. And traditional digital forensics works by, a highly qualified person in a lab, the sort of thing you might see on CSI, getting given a computer and spending, maybe hours or days extracting every iota of evidence from it, which is hugely important. But, if you've got a high profile murder case or drug case, the sort of thing that is interesting for CSI, then yeah, maybe somebody looks at that computer pretty quickly. But the reality around the world right now is that even once police have got to the stage of coming and knocking on your door and saying, we know you're downloading child abuse content, they've got a search warrant, chances are they're going to seize your computers, bag them and tag them, and they're going to go into a queue for anything from 6 months to 2 years at the lab before anybody actually extracts evidence from them to enable you to charge somebody, to take them off the streets and to safeguard children. So we need new technology in the digital forensics space. And again, that's somewhere we are working. We provide a sort of digital breathalyzer, a USB stick that law enforcement officers can take into the field, plug into a suspect's computer, and within just a couple of minutes, it will give them a red or a green light that says, yes, there's child abuse on this device, or no, there isn't. It works for terrorist content as well. It's in use at ports and borders as well as serving arrest warrants. But what that then enables the investigating officer to do is say, right, out of the 3 students sharing this internet connection in this flat, I now know it is this one that is offending, and I'm going to seize their equipment and take it to the lab, and I am going to put in, depending on the severity of what they find, we may be holding this person on remand to stop them going out and harming children, to stop them reoffending. Certainly we can put proportionate and appropriate safeguarding measures in place. And for their flatmates or for the family of the person identified as an offender, instead of seizing all their equipment because we don't know if they're implicated or not, we might be able to clear that and leave it behind. That reduces the workload on the lab, and it reduces the impact on people who have done nothing more than share an internet connection with an offender. And especially if that's a family group, I mean, it's horrible to try to imagine, but if the father of a house has just been arrested on suspicion of, accessing indecent images of children, and their teenage kids have just had all their school homework taken away on their laptops, they've had their phones taken away, they've had their, connectivity with their network, support network taken away, that's a pretty big secondary impact. So by moving forensics out to the front line, you can really help police not only deal with the high volume, but also do so in a way that has much less, much fewer negative impacts and much quicker to get to sort of positive outcomes. So technology has a role to play right through that journey. There are technologies that are already doing good, but they need to be deployed more widely and more consistently. There are new generations of technology coming along, which we're only starting to see adopted and which can have huge impact. And there are technologies to support law enforcement in doing their jobs more efficiently, more effectively, helping to keep people safe when the prevention side of it doesn't work. And it'll never be 100%. The same as people still die in car accidents, but far fewer of them.
Well, incredibly reassuring, hearing about the efficiencies that can come in, because all of us are aware of the magnitudes of data that we now produce, and as 5G gets rolled out more, we're all too aware that relying on systems that used to work a few years ago is not what's going to keep us safe and is going to be able to grab the bad people as well. So well done. You scared us and then you brought us a full circle. We're now feeling a bit more assured and actually really quite excited about, being able to see how these safeguarding technologies and these forensic technologies are able to get even faster and even more specific with what they're trying to achieve. So Ian, leave us though, keep us on this momentum of happiness and just leave us, as one of the world's leading experts in online safety, leave us with some advice, particularly me as a mother, I know you're a father, how do we best keep the internet safe?
So I think as individuals there are two things we can do. Firstly, we can be demanding as consumers. We can, there are some platforms that do more about safety than others. Vote with your feet. Use the platforms that keep people safe. When when lawmakers are considering these things, communicate with your lawmakers. Tell them that this is important to you. Encourage them to drive appropriate and proportionate regulation. And some lawmakers seem to, be trying to go a very long way and, potentially create a police state online, which I don't think would be productive, but encourage lawmakers to engage with this issue. So be demanding of companies, of society, and of politicians to, keep working on making the internet safer by design and by protection. But I think there's also something else that's really important as a parent. And this has actually been true throughout history, but it translates into the internet age. And that is that whether it's our children or actually whether it's our friends, the internet is never going to be completely safe. We didn't stop teaching our kids the Green Cross Code because cars got injure pedestrians less now. And we shouldn't stop teaching our kids about resilience. So I think it's really important. My son's been watching YouTube Kids for, a number of years now. And even before we let him start doing that, we talked to him about the fact that not every video is going to be a video you'll like. And if you find a video you don't like, you don't have to watch it. And if it scares you, come and talk to mum and dad. And, obviously, as he gets older, as your children get older, their use of the internet will change and it will move away from child-only platforms to more mixed platforms. They will start wanting to consume different types of content, consume games. They will start wanting to connect with their friends through some of those games. Then they will start wanting to connect with other people. And I think what's really important is that we have these conversations. We talk to our children, we talk to them, and we say, in the online world, bad things will happen. In the same way as we say crossing the road, bad things can happen. And we help them think about how to cope with that. We help them think about, what would you do if you saw something online that you thought was really, really horrible? What would you do if somebody was bullying you? In the same way as we talk about what you would do if somebody was bullying you in the school playground. So trying to educate and trying to build resilient children who know what to do if something wrong does happen, I think is really important, because much as I'm an enormous advocate for safety tech, and I think there's an enormous amount that can and should be done, it will never be 100%. And it's not realistic to expect it to be. Our children can still be bullied in the playground. Why should we expect that to be different online? So building that resilience, and it's not just about children, it's also being sensitive about what's happening to, our parents. My parents are older now and have less awareness of, romance scams and fraud and things like that online. So how can we make sure we're having those conversations, throughout society? If our friends are online, some of our friend group may get picked on or bullied or may become exposed to content that they don't want to be, and sort of recognizing that and having it as part of a conversation, so we become more resilient to it as well is important. And I don't believe that's a defeatist response. I'm not saying we can't make things better. We can and should. I'm just saying that unfortunately human beings suck. They've consistently sucked throughout history, and we've consistently supported each other, and the online space shouldn't be any different. And having those conversations, especially with children, but sometimes with older people, and being there to support our friends if they're struggling with something, is an extremely important part of it as well. And that comes from awareness. And I hope that, podcasts like this, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this, will help make people more aware of these things.
Brilliant, Ian. Thank you so much. There is nothing I like better than having a real geek out on technology, but being able to bring that back to how important those human touches are and that human awareness. Thank you so much for your time today. The listeners will have gained a huge amount of value and thinking points from the way that you've structured such an important topic. And thank you to all our listeners. I hope to see you again at our next ICT British Chamber of Commerce podcast.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google and the other podcast platforms. For more information about the Chamber, please visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.